Greetings, fellow moviegoers, and welcome to Movie Central, the place to talk about movies, TV shows based on movies, toys based on movies, games based on movies, and rides based on movies. I'm your host, Mr. CCS, and this is my pet gorilla, George. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's Superman! What else can be said about Superman? He's the very first superhero released mainstream. He's faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. He fights for truth, justice, and the American way. And he's also had a ton of representation in the decades after his debut into Action Comics #1. The character had 2 big screen adaptations starring Kirk Alyn, a TV series starring George Reeves, a TV pilot starring Johnny Rockwell, though he was technically referred to as Superboy, not Superman, a musical, which led to a 1975 TV adaptation starring David Wilson, and finally, arguably the most iconic, a multi-million-dollar movie starring Christopher Reeve. This movie is importantly mainly because it was the first ever comic book movie taken seriously, and considering the fact that most comic book media was fluff due to its focus on goofiness, this tone somehow fits Superman so well as to this day, nearly 45 years later, it is praised left and right, and widely regarded as the best comic book movie ever made. But, seeing as how I covered the entirety of the first 3 phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe during Season 1, #shameless plug, and the slew of DC Comics media in regards to the last 30 years, including the widely acclaimed projects of Bruce Timm, Alan Burnett, and Paul Dini, such as Batman the Animated Series, Superman the Animated Series, and Justice League, which, yes, I will get to very soon, Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, some of the DCEU films, keyword being some, Matt Reeves' The Batman, and a crap ton of amazing animated productions. Does this movie still hold up as well as it should? Well, you guys are going to find out today. This is Superman, the movie. I can't really discuss the plot of this movie, because, let's face it, it's kind of all over the place. I guess you could say it's Superman's first 3 days as a hero, but I really don't know. It focuses on the important story beats such as Krypton and its fate, Clark as a teenager, and his rather quick transition to hero, him working at the Daily Planet, him falling in love, and him saving the world. It's incredibly hard to really put together because of how messy it is, but I gave it my shots. Yeah, for the first time in a long time, I really can't string together a cohesive plot. There are elements of one, but I don't really see one altogether. It's very messy and quite vague. However, I honestly think that was the point. The movie really doesn't seem to be about plot, but rather a showcase of how great the character is, which is perfectly serviceable. But I would be lying if I said I didn't have any problems with this. This is not the comic book movie formula I'm used to, and it makes me sad that this movie went down the route it did, because it makes me struggle to like it more. But while the movie has a weak story, are there other aspects of this movie that make it as good as people remember? Well, let's find out. Honestly, while I didn't see a definitive journey this version of the character went through, Christopher Reeve's Superman is a perfectly serviceable version of the character. On the one hand, he's the very geeky loser that is Clark Kent, and on the other, he's the calm, collected, and sometimes aggressive, only when the plot needs him to be, superhero that is honestly such a blast to be around. Seriously, Superman being a kind individual was always one of my favorite parts of the character, and they nailed it perfectly in this movie. So I give Superman's character in this movie a 10 out of 10. He was that good. The other characters, however, are kinda meh. Lois Lane is a cool character, and Margot Kidder did give a decent performance, but what did she do in this movie? For one, she gets in trouble in her 3rd scene in the movie. It is an iconic moment with the line, "You've got me, who's got you," but the fact remains that actions speak louder than iconography to me. Later on, she gushes over Superman and does fly with him in a cool moment, but rather stupidly lets go of his hand and nearly plummets to her doom. Why would you let go of his hand? And finally, she dies in an avalanche only for Supes to save her in a convenient way. We'll get to that in a moment. I always saw Lois as the down-to-earth personality that brought Superman the fact that he is on Earth and makes him seem more human. But here, she's just a damsel that he needs to save, which is fine in the earlier comics. But now we live in a time for change, and the version we have now is far more inventive than just a damsel in distress. As for Jamie Olsen, he's somewhat idiotic in his last scene, but the idea is he's 17 years old, and it isn't entirely aware of his surroundings, so they pretty much nailed his character, and also because I like Mark McClure in this role, so I can't judge. As for Ma and Pa Kent, well, you won't believe me when I say this, but they have the least amount to do in this entire movie. That's right, the characters that have so much development in future adaptations have little to nothing to do in this movie. Pa Kent does die, which is a decent enough motivation for Clark to become Superman, but Ma just has 3 scenes and then she's gone for the rest of the movie. Honestly, Man of Tomorrow, the most recent movie that was animated from Superman, Smallville, and from what I've seen and heard of it, Superman the Animated Series, did a far better job at developing these 2 characters. This movie didn't really try. And as for his biological parent, Jor-El has 3 scenes in the beginning, and then he dies with his wife. And then we have hologram Jor-El, which is fine, and I don't really take issue with that. Heck, Man of Steel did the same thing too, so I can't complain. As for our villain, we have Lex Luthor, played by Gene Hackman, and he was a decent villain. His evil plan of destroying California, why is it always us, to create a new evil lair for himself is somewhat clever, as much as it is goofy, and he can be quite cynical. With those praises, however, I do have problems. For one, Lex Luthor was never this over-the-top goofy. Lex Luthor in the DC animated universe, he was a calm, collected businessman who tried to take over the world, slowly but surely, and he took no BS from anyone except for Superman and even the Joker sometimes. But here, they dumb him down a lot, and I know the reason for that. His 2 hench people, both of whom are not in the comics. Otis is just a bumbling idiot. And what sucks is that the late Ned Beatty, who played Lotso 32 years later, who was a collected and ruthless villain, plays this part, and that is disgraceful. And then we have Miss Tessmacher, who's just... I don't even know what to say about her, other than the fact that she gets redeemed because of a bomb that can kill her mother, and she also kisses Superman, so that's a thing. So overall, the best character in this movie is the man himself, and the others are just decent or non-existent. So they aren't really all that, but the effects are pretty close to all that. The earthquake effects in the third act do hold up and look much better than the effects from the Earthquake movie. The flying effects actually also hold up pretty well, minus the blurriness around Superman. But yeah, the effects for a 1970s movie do hold up. It's no Star Wars, but it's still nice looking. As for the music, well, that is handled by the maestro of music himself, John Williams, who developed the most iconic theme associated with the character. Even if you don't know anything about the character, you know this song. Now, this would be the time where I talk about the action, but there isn't any action sequence in the movie, other than the rescuing of the helicopter in the finale. So instead, I'll talk about the weirdest part of the movie with the way it ends. So the finale focuses upon 2 missiles flying towards the United States. Superman stops one, but the other destroys California, which causes an avalanche to kill Lois. Enraged, Supes flies into space and flies around the planet and reverses the effects of the earthquake. Now, everybody has talked about how this scene makes no sense. I'm about to do the same. The whole thing makes no sense whatsoever because it brings up one nasty, annoying plot hole. What are the consequences to this? Does it not ruin the space-time continuum? Does the missile get relaunched? Is everybody affected by this? None of these questions are given clear answers, and that's what stresses me out about this moment. There is no freaking clarity. So with that, what's my final verdict? It may come off that I hate Superman the movie, but I don't. I'm just very indifferent to it. And if it came down to personal preference, the movie would get a 5 out of 10. However, I thought about the movie again, and I realized that without this movie, we wouldn't have gotten the great DC stuff we have today. So for that, I give the movie 2 extra points to my final score. Superman the movie gets a 7 out of 10. Well, that's it for this review. I know I'm going to get some hate for this, but this is my show and you're going to hear my opinion. So feel free to leave your thoughts on this movie below and tune in next week when I take a look at the sequel. With that said, my name is Mr. CCS, this is Movie Central, and that, my friends, is a wrap. See you next week.